Elia Townsend walked into class with nothing but her math journal. By the end of the period, she was accused of cheating. The problem? Her solution was more advanced than the teacher's own answer key. Instead of praise, she got detention. Instead of questions, she got silence. But when her test was leaked online, the internet uncovered something the school tried to bury for years. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The soft hum of the air conditioner was the only thing that acknowledged Elia Townsend as she slipped into room 212, the math classroom that always felt colder than the rest of the school. It wasn't the temperature alone, it was the chill of being unseen. The desks were arranged in rigid rows, sunlight filtering through the blinds, catching the dust suspended between the beams. Every morning, 13-year-old Elia chose the same seat in the front row, directly beneath the whiteboard, as if positioning herself closer to the lesson might make her visible. She unfolded her notebook with deliberate care, her pencil poised before the bell even rang. She came ready to learn, ready to contribute, ready to be heard. Yet each day reminded her how a keen mind could be dismissed simply because it lived in a black girl's body. From the moment Mr. Dalton stepped inside, his presence carried the finality of a closed door. He performed the daily ritual of acknowledging the students he deemed worth his attention. Always the same ones, always the ones who looked nothing like her. They greeted him loudly, confident in the assurance that they belonged, that their voices mattered. Behind them, Alia raised her hand with quiet confidence, hoping to be part of that belonging for once. But her hand lingered in the air like an unanswered plea, suspended in a silence only she seemed to hear. The lesson began, and Mr. Dalton paced with a rehearsed authority, scribbling equations without looking up. When a familiar pattern emerged on the board, Alia's mind sparked. She recognized the numbers instantly, remembering her late-night practice sessions where she traced patterns across her notebook like a secret language. Today's problem mirrored an example she had studied on her own. She lifted her hand higher, waiting for acknowledgement. But Miss Dalton's gaze drifted past her the way a passerby looks through a window without recognizing the face staring back. A boy in the third row mumbled an answer, barely coherent, but Mr. Dalton praised it as brilliant insight. The students chuckled, entertained by their classmates' accidental spotlight. Meanwhile, Alia lowered her hand slowly, the familiar sting of rejection settling across her shoulders like a heavy shawl. She wondered how many times a person needed to be ignored before they stopped trying altogether. As the minutes ticked by, whispers floated around her. Girls behind her snickered, exchanging comments that floated just loud enough to be heard but soft enough to maintain deniability. Their words carried the bite of ridicule, the kind that framed curiosity as arrogance and intelligence as an unnecessary disturbance. They claimed she was trying too hard, as if effort was an offense. Their laughter didn't sting because of the jokes themselves. It hurt because she recognized the truth behind their tone. They genuinely believed her ambition was a disruption to the natural order of the classroom, a place where students like her weren't meant to shine. Elia kept her eyes lowered, trying to focus on her notes, but the page blurred. The room felt smaller, the walls inching closer, compressing her breath. She forced herself to straighten, refusing to let humiliation reshape her spine. Yet even as she reclaimed her posture, she couldn't escape the sense that invisibility was a weight pressing her down. The class moved to a new topic, one involving geometric proofs. The lines and angles sparked a restless hunger in Elia's mind. She had studied these at home, tracing shapes onto the backs of envelopes when her notebooks filled up. She recognized the theorem before Mr. Dalton finished writing it. Her hand rose again, not from stubbornness but from genuine passion. But the moment Mr. Dalton's eyes landed near her, they shifted away as if acknowledging her would disrupt the entire flow of his lesson. It wasn't always this way. In the early weeks of school, she had believed in fairness. She believed that raising her hand meant something, that questions were gateways to deeper understanding. But the more she tried, the more she saw how her efforts were met with impatience. Miss Dalton often addressed her with a clipped tone, the kind used for students who were expected to misbehave. Sometimes he didn't need words at all. The tightening of his jaw, the tapping of his markers, the sigh he tried to hide but couldn't, all signaled a growing intolerance for her presence. Still, she tried. She reminded herself that learning was worth fighting for. Her mother always told her that brilliance came with responsibility, and responsibility demanded commitment. But today, something felt different. The air tasted heavier, sharper. The space between her and the teacher felt wider, an uncrossable distance marked by silent judgment. When Mr. Dalton introduced an example problem that seemed incomplete, Elia noticed the gap instantly. She understood that the missing step was crucial, and without it, the class might misunderstand the logic of the proof. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should risk raising her hand again, but the part of her that valued truth over comfort compelled her. Her hand rose slowly, respectfully. For a moment, Mr. Dalton paused. His eyes flickered in her direction, a flash of acknowledgement that made her inhale sharply. But instead of calling on her, he turned away and called on a student who hadn't raised a hand at all. The wrong answer spilled from the student's mouth, and the class erupted in light laughter. Even then, Mr. Dalton refused to look at her. It was then that something in her cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but with the quiet force of a fault line shifting beneath the earth. She suddenly realized how much of herself she poured into a system designed not to see her. The weight of being overlooked began to seep deeper, lodging into the soft corners of her confidence. She continued to take notes, but her pencil felt heavier with each stroke. Her vision dimmed at the edges, as frustration simmered inside her. She wasn't angry at the lesson, nor the teacher, but at the realization that no amount of brilliance could pierce the barrier built between her and opportunity. Her mind raced through every moment she had been silenced, every time she tried to speak only to be drowned out by indifference. The room grew quieter as the class transitioned into independent work. Papers rustled, chairs scraped, and footsteps echoed faintly as Mr. Dalton moved between desks. Aaliyah worked quickly, completing the problem set with precision, though her heart wasn't in it. She placed her paper at the edge of her desk, hoping at least the work could speak where her voice couldn't. But then it happened, the moment that would carve itself into her memory. As Mr. Dalton walked past her row, he paused at her desk. He picked up her paper without a word, scanning it briefly before returning it face down. His expression held no acknowledgement, no hint of approval or respect. Instead, he addressed the class with a comment that felt like a blade, suggesting that students needed to be careful not to rush through assignments just to appear ahead. Though he didn't say her name, every eye in the room drifted toward her. Her chest tightened, her vision blurred. The humiliation was sharp enough to bruise. She lowered her head, and in that moment she made a decision that would change everything. A decision born not from anger, but from exhaustion. She decided she would stop raising her hand. But before she could begin processing the weight of that choice, something unexpected happened, something that would haunt her far longer than the silence she was choosing. As the bell rang and students filed out, an object slipped from the edge of her desk and fell quietly to the floor. She bent to pick it up, and when her fingers brushed the surface, she froze. It wasn't hers. It was a folded note, left anonymously. Inside was a sentence that made her heart stop. A sentence that hinted someone in the room had been watching her far more closely than she imagined. The note contains a message that shakes her to the core, revealing she was never as invisible as she thought. The morning after discovering the anonymous note, Elia walked into room 212 with a mix of caution and curiosity. Her pulse thudded beneath her ribs like a muffled warning, but part of her still clung to the possibility that someone somewhere understood her struggle. She slipped into her usual seat, though there was nothing usual about how she felt. The room seemed sharper, as if every whisper carved its presence into the air. Even the desks looked different, arranged with the subtle precision of a battlefield rather than a classroom. Mr. Dalton stepped inside with his routine stiffness, carrying an authority that felt heavier than the textbooks he held. He wrote the day's objective across the board with quick strokes of irritation, as if the act itself annoyed him. The students chatted among themselves, tossing glances toward one another with exaggerated amusement, but their voices softened when he turned. The hierarchy in the room was well established, and he stood at the top, unquestioned, unchallenged, untouchable. Today's lesson shifted toward a more complex proof, one that built on the theorem she had spent hours studying the week before. Even in her silence, the logic of the equation pulled her in. Numbers never ignored her. Patterns never belittled her, but the man presenting them did. And it was that truth she couldn't ignore. As he guided the class through the steps, something felt off. A crucial piece of reasoning was missing, a gap so glaring that even the students who barely followed along should have noticed. But no one reacted, no one questioned. They were conditioned not to. A familiar fire flickered inside her, not confidence, not rebellion, but the pure instinct of wanting to understand. She raised her hand before she had time to reconsider. For a moment, the classroom fell into a hush, as if her gesture altered the current of the room. Mr. Dalton paused, marker suspended in the air, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. When he finally turned toward her, his eyes held a coldness she had only sensed before but never fully seen. He stared as though her raised hand was an affront to his authority, a challenge he refused to acknowledge. Yet she kept her arm up, steady and unwavering, the determination in her movement, a quiet defiance she didn't realize she was capable of. When she asked her question gentle, logical, necessary, the room shifted. A wave of discomfort swept through her classmates. Not because her question was wrong, but because it demanded an answer from someone who hadn't expected to be held accountable. She pointed out the missing step, the inconsistency in the proof, and explained how the logic couldn't work without clarification. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was weighted, stretched thin like a rope about to snap. Mr. Dalton stared at her, and something in his expression hardened. His face shifted into a mask of strained patience. Yet beneath it, a storm brewed. He walked toward her desk slowly, each measured step tapping against the tiles like a warning. When he stopped in front of her, he didn't acknowledge her insight. He didn't correct the proof. He didn't explain the missing logic. Instead, he labeled her question as disruption. His voice was low but sharp, crafted to cut through her confidence without raising suspicion. He accused her of challenging his authority, of creating confusion among the students, of derailing the lesson with unnecessary commentary. He claimed she was interrupting, not learning. He framed her curiosity as insubordination, her intelligence as defiance. The class erupted into scattered snickers, the kind that burrow into the skin and linger long after the moment passes. They weren't laughing at the proof. They were laughing at her. Some leaned back in their seats, smirking. Others exchanged glances filled with smug relief that they weren't the ones being targeted. In that moment, Aaliyah realized how quickly an entire room could turn against a single voice, especially when that voice came from someone who looked like her. Mr. Dalton ordered her out of the classroom, not with an explanation, not with a conversation, but with finality. She rose from her seat slowly, her legs trembling, as embarrassment wrapped itself around her like a rope. The walk toward the door felt endless. Every step stretched the hallway farther, as if the floor wanted to swallow her before she reached the exit. Her face burned with humiliation, not from guilt but from the injustice of being punished for thinking critically. Behind her the laughter continued, faint, cruel, unforgettable. The hallway greeted her with empty silence. Her footsteps echoed against the lockers as she walked toward the principal's office, each strike of her shoes like another reminder of her isolation. She kept her gaze lowered, unable to meet the reflections in the trophy case she passed. The bright gold awards glared back at her, celebrating achievements that seemed reserved for students who never had to prove their right to exist in the room. When she reached the office, she sat in the plastic chair outside the door, hands folded tightly in her lap. She stared at the floor tiles, tracing the cracks between them to distract herself from the growing ache in her chest. She replayed the moment over and over, the raised hand, the missing proof, the accusation, and each time her guilt diminished while her outrage grew. She had asked a question, nothing more. But in that classroom, her question carried weight it never should have. When the principal finally called her in, the conversation felt rehearsed. He warned her about disrespect, about classroom order, about the importance of listening to authority. His tone was calm, but beneath it lay a deeper assumption. She was the problem. Her intellect was the disruption. Her curiosity was the threat. She left the office with a slip of paper she didn't deserve, and a shame she didn't earn. The rest of the school day blurred together. The stares in the hallway, the half-hidden smirks, the whispered comments she wasn't meant to hear. They all circled her like shadows she couldn't shake. By the final bell, she had sunk into a silence that felt heavier than anything she had carried before. That night, at home, she sat at her desk staring at her math journal. The pages were filled with weeks of notes, questions, and ideas, proof that her mind reached beyond the boundaries set for her. But now, those pages felt like reminders of a future she wasn't allowed to touch. She lifted the first page, then another, then another. Every line she saw, every formula, every sketch felt like a betrayal. Her brilliance had made her a target. Her curiosity had cost her the one thing she valued most, her voice. With shaking hands, she tore the first page from the spiral, then the second, then the third. The sound of ripping paper echoed through her room, like a quiet thunder. She tried to stop herself, but the frustration had rooted itself too deep. By the time she finished, her journal lay in shreds across the floor, her dreams scattered with it. She stood there breathing heavily, staring at the pieces as if watching parts of herself she could never put back together. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, dense, unforgiving. Fine. She made a vow to herself in that moment, one built from exhaustion rather than resolve. She would never raise her hand again. She would never question, never challenge, never speak in class. If her silence protected her from humiliation, then silence would become her shield. But silence was never fully silent. The next morning, as she sat quietly in her seat with her eyes fixed downward, she felt it, the weight of someone's gaze resting on the back of her neck. It wasn't mocking or dismissive. It was observing, studying, almost concerned. Someone had noticed her silence, and that someone had been watching long before she realized she wasn't alone. As she gathered her books at the end of the period, a shadow drifted behind her, someone who knew exactly why she had gone silent, and who had plans of their own. The note Elia found beneath her desk sat crumpled in her pocket the entire walk home. Her fingers brushed it more than once, as if its presence grounded her in a reality she hadn't yet chosen to face. She had no idea who wrote it. There was no signature, no handwriting she recognized. Just 10 scribbled words that echoed louder than any insult she'd ever heard, whispered in the hallway. "You're not wrong. I see it too. Keep going." The words haunted her. Not because they were kind, but because they confirmed a silent truth she had buried beneath shame. Someone else had been watching. She wasn't imagining the bias, the neglect, the disproportionate punishment. Someone had seen it unfold and still remained silent. Until now. Back in room 2D12. Aliyah had become a ghost. She no longer raised her hand, no longer dared to lean forward in her seat. The light in her eyes dimmed, not from lack of intellect, but from the weight of enforced invisibility. She still turned in her assignments on time, still aced her quizzes, but her presence was quieter, more withdrawn. She no longer corrected Mr. Dalton's oversights. She no longer tried to show them she belonged. But someone else noticed her silence, and missed the sound it used to carry. Eli Whitmore had always been the shadow in the back row, the boy who avoided eye contact and mumbled when called on. His silence was intentional, a practiced shield against ridicule. He had no need to be seen, and even less need to be praised. But Eli had a secret of his own. He noticed everything, not just math problems and patterns, but people, reactions, shifts in power. The way Mr. Dalton's voice softened when addressing certain students, and sharpened like a blade when addressing others. He had noticed Elia from the very beginning, not just her questions but the teacher's resistance to her presence. Eli's older sister, Morgan, had once worked in a tech firm where she was overlooked for promotions while being asked to train the men who got them. She had come home one night crying, saying the word invisible like it was a curse. Eli had heard her, and in that moment, something shifted in him, a readiness to recognize injustice, even when it came wrapped in politeness or authority.
That was why he had started taking notes, not of lessons, but of moments. He logged every time Alea was dismissed, every time her right answer went unacknowledged, every instance Mr. Dalton used discipline instead of dialogue. He kept them in a second spiral notebook, one he never let anyone see, not because he planned to use it, but because recording truth felt like a small act of resistance.
Weeks after the incident that sent Elia to the principal's office, Eli approached her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply left another note inside the math textbook she kept in her locker. This time he signed it with his initials, EW. He offered help, not as a tutor, but as an equal, a partner, someone who believed she didn't need permission to be smart.
Alea didn't respond at first.
Trust had been shattered too many times, and coming from a white boy in her class, the very demographic she'd seen benefit most from staying silent, it felt suspicious, even dangerous. But as the days passed, and Miss Dalton's indifference only grew, she realized that her questions hadn't disappeared. They had only gone unspoken, and they were beginning to rot inside her. She accepted his offer with caution. They met at the local library under the pretense of homework. It was a neutral ground, quiet, surrounded by knowledge, with no authority watching over them. The first session was awkward. Elia barely made eye contact, and Eli rarely spoke unless he was pointing at a solution. But over time, something unexpected happened. The space between them grew smaller, not just physically but emotionally. Alea rediscovered her curiosity. Without fear of judgment, she asked questions again. She challenged equations. She retraced the steps of complex proofs until they unraveled like stories in her mind. And Eli didn't just sit silently. He learned from her. He saw the way she visualized math, not as formulas but as systems of logic wrapped in rhythm. He began to realize her intelligence wasn't just advanced, it was revolutionary. During one session, Eli pulled out the notebook where he had logged Mr. Dalton's behavior. Elia stared at the pages, each entry dated and described. It wasn't just emotional validation, it was evidence, written proof that she hadn't imagined any of it. She flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers trembling as she read her experiences through someone else's eyes. Her emotions cracked open in ways she hadn't anticipated. She felt seen, but also violated. How long had he been watching? Why hadn't he said anything sooner? Yet beneath the confusion was something deeper. Relief. The kind that arrives when you realize your reality has been witnessed and recorded. Her pain wasn't invisible after all. They continued to meet, and slowly, their sessions became a ritual. They brought snacks. They shared strategies. And sometimes, in rare moments of quiet, they spoke about more than math. Elia told him about her mother, Simone, who worked 2 jobs and still found time to check her homework. Eli spoke of Morgan, now an activist for workplace equity. They never named it friendship, but what they were building was something just as powerful. Yet something else was happening. Something Elia couldn't explain. As her understanding of math deepened, so did her clarity about how power functioned in her world. She started noticing other patterns in the cafeteria, in gym class, in the books assigned in English. It wasn't just Mr. Dalton, it was the entire structure. The advanced classes filled with white students, the disciplinary referrals overwhelmingly given to black ones, the subtle segregation playing out in real time. For the first time she realized her struggle wasn't personal, it was systemic. It was this realization that began to transform her. She no longer wanted to just survive the classroom. She wanted to change it. But she knew better than to speak too soon. Silence had taught her the art of listening. And now she listened carefully, to her classmates' comments, to the assignments chosen, to the policies written in language that looked neutral but punished kids who looked like her. One afternoon, Eli showed her something new. A printout of a math competition flyer, regional qualifiers happening in 2 months. He suggested they sign up. Elia laughed bitterly. He didn't understand. Her participation would raise more than eyebrows. It would raise suspicion, backlash, maybe even more punishment. She wasn't ready to be that visible again. But he insisted. Not for the glory, but for the statement. That brilliance shouldn't have to hide. That maybe, just maybe, they could prove something no one expected. Elia took the flyer home and placed it inside her math journal, the one she had ripped up weeks ago, but couldn't bring herself to throw away. The journal now held a new section, filled with equations, theories, and questions drawn from her sessions with Eli. But on the final page, she began something else, a tally of her own. Not of mistreatment, but of every time she reclaimed a piece of herself. And just as her confidence began to root itself again, something unexpected shattered her progress. At the next school assembly, Mr. Dalton stood before the student body, receiving a Teaching Excellence Award. Applause roared across the auditorium as he smiled for the cameras. Elia sat in the 3rd row, her palms sweating, her body frozen. The man who had silenced her, who had tried to erase her curiosity, was being celebrated. But what chilled her most wasn't the applause. It was the brief moment when his eyes met hers. And in them she saw something new. Not guilt, not shame, but warning. As if he knew she had begun to rise. As if he knew she wasn't done. And as the assembly ended, a folded paper was slid under her seat. This time with a threat that would make her question if learning was still safe. The cold weight of humiliation lingered on Elia's shoulders for days after her trip to the principal's office. In class she no longer raised her hand, no longer made eye contact, no longer dared to question what she knew was flawed. But inside her the equations still swirled, the curiosity still surged, though now it lived underground, hidden beneath the rubble of broken trust. She showed up, completed her assignments, and disappeared into her seat, like a shadow that refused to cast itself. But someone had been paying attention, closer attention than she realized. Eli Whitmore didn't confront her directly. He was deliberate, quiet. He didn't walk over to her desk, didn't pass her notes during class, didn't risk any interaction that could make her the center of attention again. Instead, he slipped a folded sheet of paper inside the hollow of her locker during lunch, timed carefully, when he knew she wouldn't be there. It wasn't a note filled with empty platitudes or savior-like sympathy. It was a proposal, a place, a time, a single sentence. Let's work through the theorems they won't let you ask about. The address was clear, the local public library after school, every Wednesday and Friday. At first, Aaliyah hesitated. Her mind was still raw from what had happened, still blistering from the way her voice had been twisted into rebellion. She wasn't ready to trust anyone, least of all a white boy from the same classroom that had watched her humiliation unfold like a slow-motion collapse. But the ache in her mind wouldn't rest. Math was the only place she had once felt limitless, and now, every unanswered question inside her festered like a wound refusing to close. So she went. The library was quiet and unassuming, its brick facade aged but comforting. Inside, the scent of old paper wrapped around her like a whisper of welcome. The far corner, near the oversized windows, became their meeting spot. At first, their interactions were mechanical. Two students exchanging notes, scanning problems, scribbling formulas in silence. Aaliyah kept her voice low and her distance wide, but even in those early sessions, something stirred beneath the quiet. Eli didn't explain things to her, as if she were beneath him. He challenged her. When she solved something quickly, he pushed the problem further. When she got stuck, he offered another route, not a solution. He respected her pace and mirrored her intensity. Slowly, the guard she had constructed from shame began to fracture. By their third session, she was no longer just reviewing what Mr. Dalton had skimmed over. She was solving problems well beyond their grade level. Concepts from high school algebra, pre-calculus, and even early calculus began to appear in her notes. Aaliyah devoured them. She filled notebooks again, not with shame but with strategy. Her mind reawakened like a dormant machine springing to life, its gears grinding with focus and fury. She still said nothing in class. The damage there was done. Mr. Dalton barely acknowledged her anymore, and that suited her just fine. She had no plans to reclaim space in a room that had punished her for simply wanting to understand. Instead, she poured herself into their library sessions, and in doing so, she found something unexpected, a version of herself untouched by judgment, one who knew exactly what she was capable of, even if no one else did. Eli noticed the shift in her energy. She moved faster through problems, asked deeper questions, and began proposing her own methods for solving proofs. He watched her brilliance ignite like a spark lighting dry kindling, fierce, fast, and impossible to ignore. But what he noticed even more was how little she smiled. Her confidence was returning, yes, but not her joy. That had been stolen, and she didn't yet know how or if it could be recovered. One rainy afternoon, they met as usual. Thunder rolled softly in the background as rain tapped against the tall windows. Aaliyah had just finished explaining a complex proof she had restructured on her own, reducing what should have been 10 steps into 5. Eli sat stunned, not by the math, but by the way she casually pushed the boundaries of logic without even realizing she was doing it. He opened his notebook to compare the traditional method, but paused when he noticed something. She had drawn a spiral on the margin of her page, a tight coil pressed in with the same intensity as her writing. It looked frantic, repetitive, as if her mind needed somewhere to release what her mouth refused to say. For the first time, Eli realized that brilliance could coexist with trauma, that one didn't cancel the other. They weren't studying just to learn, they were studying to survive. Meanwhile, in room 2-12, Mr. Dalton's behavior remained unchanged. He continued favoring the same students, continued brushing off others, continued crafting an environment where questioning was an act of war. But on a Thursday morning, the door opened, and with it came a disruption no one expected. A substitute. Ms. Carter walked in with a clipboard, and a quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. She was young, sharply dressed, and immediately observant. Her eyes scanned the room, taking mental inventory, not just of the seating chart, but of the silences. She noticed who answered questions too quickly, who avoided eye contact, and who didn't speak at all. When class began, she followed Mr. Dalton's lesson plan. At first, but by midweek she started asking her own questions. Questions that required critical thinking, not memorization. Questions that didn't have neat answers. When she asked for volunteers, she noticed Aaliyah's lowered eyes. Her quiet competence. She saw the pattern in how the classroom operated, who dominated the conversation, who got praised, and who faded into the wall. And she began testing that pattern. On Friday, Miss Carter presented a set of challenge problems, ones not found in the textbook. She told the class they wouldn't be graded. There were no points, no pressure, only the chance to explore. The students groaned, uninterested. Most fumbled through them lazily, circling numbers or guessing. Aaliyah glanced at the sheet and froze. She knew the first answer instantly. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't luck. It was truth. Her pencil moved before she could stop it, solving the first 3 problems in under 2 minutes. She didn't mean to finish the whole page, but when she looked down, every answer stared back at her, clear and precise. She didn't raise her hand, she simply folded the page and slipped it to the edge of her desk. Miss Carter collected the papers at the end of class. She glanced through them quickly, but paused when she reached Elias. Her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in realization. That night, Aliyah barely slept. Her mind wouldn't settle. Had she just broken her own vow of invisibility? Had her work betrayed her silence? The next morning, when the bell rang for math, Ms. Carter greeted the class with a calm smile. She handed out a new set of problems, more difficult this time. She walked the aisles casually, watching, listening, and then with deliberate precision, she placed a single page on Aya's desk. It was her paper from the day before, marked only with a circle around one problem, and a note written beneath it. "Explain this to me after class?" It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. Aaliyah stared at the paper. No red marks, no condescension, just curiosity. Respectful, direct curiosity. For the first time in weeks, she felt a crack in the silence she had wrapped around herself. Not enough to speak yet, but enough to breathe differently. She didn't know what Miss Carter's intentions were, but she sensed something. This teacher wasn't like the others. And she was right. Because what Aliyah didn't know, what no one knew, was that Miss Carter wasn't just a substitute. She was also part of a state education equity task force. And she had been sent to observe classrooms, flagged for unexplained racial disparities in discipline, and gifted program access. What Ms. Carter saw in Iaya's paper would set off a quiet investigation, and a trap designed to expose Mr. Dalton for what he really was. The morning light filtered through the classroom blinds in thin, fractured lines, casting stripes of gold across the desks in room 212. Ms. Carter stood at the front with a calm expression that masked the calculations unfolding in her mind. She had spent the previous night reviewing every paper from her challenge assignment, cross-referencing handwriting, cross-checking accuracy, and noting the unsettling consistency in who excelled and who never received the chance to show they could. The pattern was clear, unmistakable, and deeply troubling. Aliya's paper rested at the top of her clipboard, separate from the others, as if it radiated a quiet brilliance too important to mix with the rest. She had studied the girl's work again and again, tracing the clean logic of every line, the innovative shortcuts, the near-effortless way she had dismantled a complex pattern with the intuition of someone far beyond her age. The details struck her hardest. This wasn't the work of a student who guessed. It was the work of someone who understood. Today she had a plan, one designed not to expose students, but to expose the system that had failed them. When the bell rang, the usual chatter filled the room, but the moment Miss Carter lifted a stack of crisp papers, silence washed through the aisles like an unseen wave. She announced an unplanned assessment, something not recorded in grades or entered in the system. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes scanned the classroom with purposeful attention. She wasn't trying to measure how well they memorized equations. She wanted to measure something far deeper, raw, unfiltered understanding. She placed a test on each desk, pausing only when she reached Aliya's seat. She didn't smile, didn't signal anything unusual. But the weight of her gaze lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Long enough for Aliyah to sense that today something was different. Something was shifting beneath the surface. The test itself was unlike anything they had seen before. It mirrored the structure of math competitions, problems that required leaps in logic, multi-step reasoning, and creative thought. Not one problem resembled what Mr. Dalton had assigned all semester. This was intentional. This was a test no one could prepare for by memorizing patterns. This was a test that rewarded clarity, not compliance. Pens scratched paper. Pages flipped. Breath faltered. Some students stared blankly at the questions, unsure where to begin. Others scribbled frantically, trying to force answers into existence by sheer will. But for Alea, something clicked. Every problem called to her in a voice that had been silenced, urging her to step back into the part of herself she had buried. Her pencil moved with the precision of someone rediscovering a forgotten language. The numbers didn't feel intimidating. They felt like old friends calling her home. Still, she worked slowly, carefully. She didn't want attention. She didn't want whispers. Her mind soared, but she kept her posture small, her presence quiet. When she finished the last question, she hesitated before handing it in, ensuring her name was legible, but not bold, clear but not proud. She waited until nearly every student was done before rising to place her paper onto Miss Carter's desk. It was the last one submitted, and it was flawless. Miss Carter reviewed the answers swiftly, expecting signs of struggle or partial steps. Instead, she found accuracy woven through every line, complex reasoning delivered with the ease of a seasoned competitor. With each answer she read, the suspicion she held became certainty. Alea wasn't merely gifted, she was extraordinary. She didn't just understand math, she lived in. When class ended, Miss Carter asked her to stay behind. The room emptied, leaving an echo of shifting chairs and fading footsteps. Alea stood rigidly near her desk, shoulders tense, as if preparing to be reprimanded for something she couldn't name. Miss Carter held the test in her hand, not like evidence, but like something delicate and precious. She asked Alea to explain how she solved the hardest question. The air felt still, as if waiting to see what she would do. For a moment, silence sat between them, the silence Alea had built as her shield. But as she stared at the problem and the path she had chosen, something inside her unlatched. Slowly, she began tracing her logic aloud. The explanation poured out of her, not rehearsed or hesitant, but clear and confident. Her hands moved as she spoke, drawing shapes in the air, mapping invisible lines, illustrating the elegant solution she had crafted. It was the first time she had allowed her voice to fill the classroom, since the day she was sent to the principal's office. Each word lifted a layer of fear from her chest. Each sentence reclaimed a piece of the self she had discarded. As she spoke, a quiet transformation unfolded, not in her tone but in her presence. She was not performing. She was simply being who she always had been before the world silenced her. Outside the classroom door, a few students lingered, pretending to gather their belongings while actually listening. When they realized she wasn't stumbling, she was excelling. Some froze in disbelief, others exchanged uneasy glances, wondering how they had missed the truth that now glowed unmistakably in her voice. And then the unexpected happened. The students who had once laughed at her now stared through the window with expressions that flickered between awe and embarrassment. They had witnessed her humiliation. Now they were witnessing her rise. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A quiet shift moved through the hallway, like the changing of a tide no one had predicted but everyone felt. Miss Carter's expression softened with each sentence. Alea spoke, not with pity, but with recognition. She saw every detail, every nuance, every spark, and understood exactly what this girl had been denied. The brilliance she displayed wasn't new, it was simply unseen. When Alea finished, the room felt different, lighter, warmer, as if a weight had been lifted from the floorboards themselves. For a fleeting moment, she stood taller, not physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. She felt like herself again. But the world outside that door wasn't ready to celebrate her yet. Because the next morning, the door to room 212 opened, and Mr. Dalton returned. He stepped inside with his usual stiff posture, but his expression held something new. He sensed it immediately, the shift, the whisper of something changed. A silence no longer rooted in fear, but in anticipation. His eyes swept the classroom, and though no one spoke, the air carried the truth. Something had happened in his absence. Something he hadn't controlled. Something that threatened the fragile hierarchy he'd built. And when his gaze stopped on Alea, her chest tightened. He narrowed his eyes, reading the room like a puzzle that didn't fit together anymore. He smelled the change. He felt the threat, and he knew without hearing a word that something was coming. By lunchtime, rumors began circulating through the school, and one of them carried a warning, a whisper that Mr. Dalton intended to reclaim control, no matter the cost. Mr. Dalton stood frozen in his doorway that morning, his coffee cooling untouched in his hand. He had returned expecting silence, submission, and the same obedient routine that shaped his comfort. But what greeted him was something colder, respectful, but distant. Students whispered less, looked up more, and a subtle gravity had shifted toward the girl he had tried to bury under ridicule. He had noticed immediately. Alaya no longer flinched when called upon. Not that he did. She sat with a calm stillness, her back straight, her eyes focused, her energy unreadable. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't shrink. That unsettled him more than anything. He had trained his class to accept a hierarchy disguised as order, and she had dared to step outside it without permission. That morning, he opened his gradebook with rigid fingers and scanned the test results from the assessment Miss Carter had administered in his absence. His eyes narrowed when he reached Alaya's name, 98%. A flawless execution of advanced logic, completed faster than most students could attempt. His breath hitched, not in admiration, but disbelief. She had never scored beyond a high B in his class, and he had made sure of it. Something didn't add up. Rather than accept the possibility that she had outperformed even his expectations, he immediately questioned the result. His pride was too calcified to allow another reality. His authority too brittle to allow a student he had suppressed to surpass those he had praised. The narrative he had curated, the one where black girls lacked discipline, where giftedness belonged to a select few, was unraveling, and he needed to stitch it back together before it slipped through his fingers. By second period, a rumor had already begun to coil through the halls. Mr. Dalton was investigating test results. But the word investigating felt heavy with implication. When Alaya arrived to class, she sensed it instantly. A hush fell over the room, not of awe but suspicion. Eyes drifted toward her not with admiration, but with quiet doubt. He began the class without his usual lecture. Instead, he pulled a single sheet of paper from his folder. Another test. This one created by him. Longer, more obscure, designed not to test learning, but to trap confidence. He called her name in front of everyone and asked her to stay after class for clarification purposes. The room tensed. When the bell rang, she stayed seated as instructed, heart pounding in her chest, but face blank. He handed her the test with a clipped explanation. This would verify her abilities, and it would be done in his classroom, under his supervision. No notes, no help, no calculator, just her, him, and the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. She didn't ask why. She already knew. The next morning, she sat alone in room 212, pen in hand, surrounded by silence. Mr. Dalton sat at his desk like a warden, watching every movement she made, every erasure, every glance. But what he didn't anticipate was how she had changed, how her confidence no longer depended on being believed, how her silence was no longer fear, but control. She completed the exam, slowly, methodically, one question at a time. When she finished, she slid the paper forward, without a word. He took it, flipping through her answers, with a furrowed brow. Again, no flaws. Her logic held, her steps were clean, her work undeniable. But he refused to accept it. That afternoon, he submitted a report to the administration, not formal, not disciplinary, but full of doubt. He suggested that her performance was inconsistent with her prior work. He implied outside assistance. He used terms like academic integrity and unusual improvement to cloud the truth with suspicion. Alaya went home that evening, with a pit in her stomach. She didn't speak during dinner. Her mother, Miss Simone, noticed immediately. A single look from her daughter said more than any words could. Later that night, Alaya slid the second test across the kitchen table. Her mother read it twice, once to absorb it, twice to believe it. The next morning, Simone Townsend walked into the school. Not as a parent but as a storm. She requested an immediate meeting with Mr. Dalton and the school's academic coordinator. Her voice was firm, composed, but each sentence carried years of fury at systems built to break confidence, to question excellence when it wore the wrong skin. She asked one question, over and over in slightly different ways. What reason, other than race, explains why her daughter's intelligence is being treated as a threat? The answers were diplomatic, evasive. They spoke in policy. They spoke in data. They tiptoed around words like concern and protocol, and consistency. But never once did they say the word she was forcing them to confront. Racism. They didn't need to. It was written in every denial, every hesitation, every assumption that brilliance had a skin tone and a zip code. They told her Alaya's progress would be monitored, that she would be reevaluated before being considered for gifted placement, that they were happy to support her learning journey if it remained within appropriate channels. The words were so polished they almost glittered. but Simone could smell the rot beneath the shine. She left that meeting and walked straight to the parking lot. But instead of going home, she sat in her car and opened her phone. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She did something far more dangerous. She uploaded a video. It was short, less than 2 minutes. In it, she calmly explained how her daughter, a straight-A student with verified math excellence, had been accused of cheating, isolated for retesting, and dismissed without evidence by a teacher with a pattern of minimizing students of color. She didn't name the school. Not yet. But she ended with a warning. They tried to silence my daughter. I'm not afraid to make noise. The video spread fast. First to other parents in the district, then to local educators, then to platforms far beyond their county. Comments poured in, some outraged, some supportive, some venomous. The algorithm took over, and with it attention. But attention cuts both ways. By the next morning, the principal had called for a private conversation. Elia wasn't invited. Simone walked in with a printout of her daughter's scores, both tests marked and verified. She laid them on the table and said nothing. The principal skimmed them, then asked if Simone would consider removing the video in exchange for accelerated placement testing. Simone didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked if any white student in the school had ever been asked to prove their intelligence twice. The silence that followed was louder than any answer. As Simone stood to leave, the coordinator attempted one last maneuver. He hinted that pursuing public complaints could jeopardize Alea's academic reputation in future applications. That was when Simone made her decision. Not only would she leave the video online, she would escalate it. She reached out to a local education reporter. And that was the beginning of something much bigger. The school board received a formal media request for public comment, and suddenly, Mr. Dalton's past began to resurface in ways no one expected. The fluorescent lights of the school board meeting flickered faintly overhead, casting a cold sheen across the long wooden table where policy met pretense. Simone Townsend sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, a stillness carved from restraint, not calm. Beside her sat Alia, silent but steady, her face composed in a way that didn't match her age. Across from them, school officials arranged their expressions into careful masks, open, neutral, and politely dismissive. Simone had come prepared. The meeting had been called under the guise of dialogue, but it unfolded more like a quiet defense of bureaucracy. The assistant superintendent read from a binder. The academic director nodded without conviction. Phrases like district standards and data inconsistencies were tossed out like shields. No one mentioned race directly, but the implication dripped from every phrase. They praised Elia's intelligence, but framed it as unexpected growth. They applauded her potential but questioned the context of her performance. One board member leaned forward and asked, with feigned concern, whether Elia had been given unauthorized coaching. That was the moment Simone clicked the button on her pen. The tiny recorder inside her purse had been active since the meeting began. But now, she lifted her phone openly and began recording on video. The room shifted. Postures stiffened. Smiles faltered. No one objected. Not out loud. Simone's voice was calm, as she repeated the question back, slowly, then asked if any white students with similar performance had ever been subjected to the same scrutiny. No one answered. Instead, the superintendent cleared his throat and suggested they move forward constructively. But the damage was done. The silence was captured. So was every veiled accusation. That night, Simone uploaded the clip to a newly created social media account. She kept the caption simple: "This is how schools question Black excellence." She closed her laptop and went to bed. By morning, the clip had over 30, and by evening it passed 300,000. By the end of the weekend, it was on national accounts. People weren't just watching, they were sharing, commenting, reposting. Hashtags exploded. Let her learn. Math while Black. Gifted but Black. Support poured in from educators, parents, former students, and activists. But beneath the waves of solidarity, an undertow of vitriol surged. Anonymous accounts calling Elia a fraud, trolls accusing Simone of weaponizing race, and threats veiled as concern about real fairness. Simone had known the internet could be cruel, but she hadn't expected how deeply the cruelty would aim. At school, Elia became more than a student. She became a symbol. Some teachers looked at her with new respect. Others avoided her entirely. The principal called her mother twice to suggest it would be best for Elia's emotional well-being if she limited her media exposure. But it was already too late for damage control. Posters began appearing on lockers overnight. One had her face on it, poorly photoshopped with the words "privilege is loud when it's not white." Another had the school's crest stamped over her name with the caption, "Not our spokesperson." Alea's locker was vandalized a week later. The lock jammed with glue. Inside, someone had written the words, "Try being smart without your race card." Her math journal was stolen. Her homework disappeared, and more devastating than any insult was the silence that followed. Students she had once worked with stopped sitting beside her. Eli tried to stay close, but his presence began drawing stares too. Whispers tracked her down the hallways. Some of the teachers praised her in private, but said nothing in meetings. Support came only when convenient, never when public. Elia didn't cry. Not in the hallways. Not at home. But something inside her began to splinter again. She had been seen, but not protected, heard but not believed by those who mattered most. And still she kept showing up. Each day she walked through the doors, her shoulders squared against the looks, her eyes forward, but the fight to simply exist began to drain her in ways she couldn't explain. She no longer trusted her notebooks to stay safe. She no longer trusted the school system to acknowledge what it had tried to erase. She was becoming known but not free. Simone watched her daughter retreat inward again, this time under the weight of recognition instead of obscurity. It was a cruel reversal. She had tried to protect her by making her visible. But the world had twisted that visibility into exposure. Her inbox was filled with interview requests, article offers and legal inquiries. But behind each was a single question she hadn't yet answered. What now? The answer came in the form of an email. It was written without flourish. No emojis. No signature. Just a name. And a subject line that read, "You don't know me, but I know this game." Simone hesitated, then opened it. The woman introduced herself simply as Jeanette Robbins, a retired educator from a nearby district. She claimed to have seen the video, claimed she had once worked under the same superintendent, claimed she had walked through a version of this storm before quietly, alone. But she wasn't quiet anymore. She said she had kept records, names, memos, whispers that had followed her for decades. She said she had watched children just like Alia get filtered out of gifted programs, rerouted into remedial classes, and labeled problem students when their brilliance didn't fit the mold. And then she said something Simone wasn't expecting. "Your daughter isn't the first, but if we move together, she could be the last." Attached to the email were redacted documents, records from past board meetings, discipline reports with uncanny similarities, teacher evaluations that hinted at repeated patterns of bias, quietly filed away, buried, forgot. Simone's hands trembled as she scrolled. It wasn't just Mr. Dalton. It was deeper. It was systemic. And suddenly the stakes weren't just about Alea anymore. They were about every child whose question was seen as rebellion. Every parent whose complaint was labeled dramatic. Every brilliance denied the right to bloom. Simone picked up the phone. Her voice was steady as she dialed the number in the email. She didn't know exactly what came next, but she knew it started with truth. On the other end of the line, Jeanette answers with a plan, and a name no one had dared speak aloud in years. The district superintendent's personal tie to a decades-old cover-up. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, measured, and unmistakably resolute. Jeanette Robbins didn't speak like someone requesting permission. She spoke like someone who had waited years for the right door to open, and now Simone Townsend had opened it. She didn't start with pleasantries. She started with a name. "Dalton," she said plainly, "has been doing this for years." Simone felt her pulse tighten. It wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. A vindication of everything she had feared, and everything her daughter had been forced to endure. Jeanette had once taught English in the very same district, 2 classrooms down the hall from Mr. Dalton, back when chalk dust still clung to sleeves, and complaints were whispered into voicemail machines that no one checked. She had seen it happen. Gifted black students mysteriously overlooked for accelerated programs, behavior referrals inflated beyond reason, conference requests ignored. She had tried quietly at first to report what she witnessed, but the district had a way of defending itself with policies that looked neutral and outcomes that said otherwise. So she stayed silent, for decades, until now. Jeanette invited Simone to meet. Not in a cafe, not at the school, but in a quiet, gated senior community on the edge of town. The kind of place where time slowed down, and no one asked too many questions. When Simone arrived, Jeanette greeted her at the door with a folder already in hand. Inside were copies of formal complaints from teachers of color, some dating back over 15 years. Most had been filed against a handful of names. Mr. Dalton appeared in 7 of them. The language was always vague. He discourages students of color from speaking up in class. He repeatedly downplays their test scores. He uses discipline selectively. Each report ended the same way: no action warranted. Jeanette had kept the originals. After retirement, she began compiling them. At first she thought she was just organizing personal closure, but when she saw Alaya's story online, raw, urgent, unfiltered, something stirred. Her silence had lasted too long. She wouldn't let it outlive her. Simone scanned the document slowly. Her jaw clenched tight as the pattern revealed itself in cold, printed ink. This wasn't about one teacher. It was a system so practiced in suppression that it had learned to bury racism beneath paperwork. Jeanette wasn't alone. She introduced Simone to a private chat room, hidden behind a password-protected site. It was called the Third Room, a quiet digital meeting place for former and current educators who had experienced or witnessed racial injustice inside public schools, but feared retaliation for speaking out. Inside were threads going back years. Some posts were only a few sentences. Others were essays. A few were confessions. Simone read testimony after testimony. Students failed for arbitrary reasons. Parents threatened with truancy charges after complaining. Gifted test referrals never submitted. Patterns upon patterns. Then came the shock. There were other names on the threads. Names from Alaya's current school. Teachers still employed. Still complicit. Still quiet. But not everyone. A user named Mrs. G214, a current math teacher, had been silently logging every inconsistency in the school's gifted program placements for the last 2 years. She kept a spreadsheet comparing test scores to placements, and the disparity was chilling. White students with borderline scores received invitations. Black students with higher performance didn't even get evaluated. Simone reached out to her anonymously. 3 days later, she received a file, securely encrypted with documents, internal emails, and access logs. Within them was something damning. An email chain in which Mr. Dalton had suggested streamlining referrals to better reflect behavior patterns. He didn't say race. He didn't have to. Every student mentioned was Black or Latino. None were referred. The evidence was mounting. So was the risk. Jeanette warned Simone gently. Once this left the file drawer, it couldn't be taken back. The district would fight dirty. They'd gaslight, discredit, possibly even threaten her job, especially if they suspected she had help from insiders. But Simone didn't blink. She had watched her daughter crumble in silence. She had watched her confidence be treated like arrogance, and her genius like disruption. If exposure brought fire, then she would walk into it holding the match. Together they began organizing. They compiled the testimonies, indexed the documents, drafted timelines. The folder grew thicker. The story grew deeper. And behind each fact was a name, a child who had been taught to be less than what they were, names without headlines. Kids whose parents didn't know how to fight back. A week later, Simone received a message from a contact Jeanette had given her, a journalist. Not from a blog, not from a fringe site, from a national news station. The producer had seen the viral video, then heard whispers from teachers who wouldn't go on record, then saw the paper trail Simone had begun building. They wanted to go live. Not a buried segment. A full televised feature. Simone sat at her kitchen table staring at the offer on her screen. She could feel the moment sharpening like a blade. This wasn't just about Alaya anymore. This was about a system of silencing dressed as schooling. But going live meant more than exposure. It meant naming names. It meant letting her face and Alaya's become part of a national story. It meant losing privacy. It meant painting a target. Simone knew exactly what they'd say. That she was dramatic, that she was dividing the community, that she was anti-educator, that she was weaponizing her child. She didn't care. She clicked reply, but before she could hit send, her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. A screenshot followed. It was a still from a school security camera, Alaya's locker. 2 figures blurred in motion. One was Eli. The other was a staff member. The message underneath read, "You're not the only one they're watching." Just hours before the interview is set to air, Eli's family receives a warning from the school district. Either stop cooperating with Simone, or face disciplinary action for interfering with administrative processes. The studio lights were blinding. Not harsh, but artificial enough to make every movement feel exposed. Simone sat with her shoulders squared, and palms clenched in her lap. Next to her, Eli adjusted the mic clipped to her collar, her expression unreadable. A producer waved from behind the camera, counting down in silent gestures. Behind them, massive screens displayed stills from the viral video, graphs on racial gaps in gifted programs, and a glowing headline, "Gifted but Silenced, One Girl's Fight Against the System." It wasn't just a segment anymore, it was a national story. The anchor introduced them with polished urgency, recounting Elia's academic excellence, the viral recording of the school board meeting, and the sudden swell of whistleblower testimony that had followed. Statistics scrolled along the bottom of the screen, numbers on disproportionate testing, underrepresentation of black girls in advanced classes, and data from the very district that had tried to ignore her. Then they played it. A clip of Mr. Dalton's classroom, submitted by another student. It showed Elia raising her hand, being passed over. A white student giving an incorrect answer and receiving praise. Then another clip, grainy, taken by someone in the hallway, of Mr. Dalton confronting Elia with the retest. Simone flinched watching it, even though she'd seen it dozens of times. The anchor turned toward Elia and asked the first real question. "Why do you think your questions were treated as disruptions?" Elia didn't look at the camera. She looked straight ahead, into space, as if drawing her thoughts from somewhere deeper than memory. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but razor sharp. She spoke of how it felt to be erased while sitting in plain sight, to raise her hand and feel invisible, to watch her curiosity turned into evidence against her. She spoke of the silence after being punished, the whispers that followed, and how fear replaced ambition, until one day it didn't. The studio went silent as she spoke, not because her words were loud, but because they didn't need to be. When she finished, the anchor turned to Simone. Her answers were steadier, more forceful. She spoke of policy gaps, hidden prejudice, and systemic indifference. She named the game the district had played, using red tape and polite language to mask discriminatory outcomes. She didn't call Mr. Dalton a villain. She called him a pattern, a symptom of something much larger. The segment ended with a direct call to action, asking school districts nationwide to reevaluate gifted placement metrics, disciplinary referral patterns, and racial equity audits. It was poised, professional, and measured. But the world didn't respond with poise. Social media erupted. Clips of Elia's voice circulated across timelines and platforms. Some hailed her as a hero. Hashtags like "Gifted Not Silent" and "Let Black Girls Learn" trended for hours. Celebrities, educators, and parents shared the video. Advocacy groups offered support. Universities sent early outreach. An educational nonprofit offered her a national youth fellowship. But with the praise came something else. Hate. It started with comments. Anonymous accounts calling Elia a liar, claiming Simone coached her, accusing them of manipulating a narrative for attention. Then came edited versions of the broadcast. Chopped, distorted, stripped of context. Then came inboxes flooded with messages. Some threatening, some mocking, some just filled with hate masquerading as concern. And then it got physical. The first envelope arrived 3 days after the broadcast aired. No return address. Inside, a note typed, not handwritten, that read, "Know your place." The second came a day later. A fake gifted program application, with Elia's name typed in, marked "rejected," back to the bomb. Simone turned both over to the police, who logged them without urgency. They promised to increase patrol presence, but no action followed. The school issued a vague statement about supporting student voices, while quietly warning teachers not to speak to media. Elia's principal stopped making eye contact in the halls. Inside their home, windows were checked twice each night. Outside, a neighbor removed his yard sign supporting their campaign to avoid tension. Even Eli, once the quiet ally, began to withdraw. His parents had received their own letter. This one threatened disciplinary interference for allowing him to collaborate with Simone and Elia, without district knowledge. The implication was clear: fall back, or get dragged in. Simone didn't blame them. Not directly, but the loneliness began to suffocate. Elia stopped going to the library. She stopped checking her email. She began sleeping in longer, eating in silence, and closing her bedroom door more than usual. She wasn't retreating from the spotlight. She was being buried under it. Simone tried to remain strong. She told herself this was the cost of truth, that visibility was the first step toward change. But even she couldn't ignore the cracks. The interviews slowed. The articles moved on. The momentum shifted elsewhere. and now they were left with the aftershock. The night before a scheduled follow-up segment, Simone found Aliyah staring at the screen of her laptop. On it, a message had popped up through a school portal, anonymous, sent through a disguised student account. It read, "Congratulations on being the smartest little liar in Georgia." Below it was a screenshot, Aliyah's test score circled in red, with a caption suggesting it had been faked. Aliyah closed the laptop without a word. Simone wanted to scream, but she didn't. She sat beside her daughter and held her hand, the same hand that had once risen so confidently in room 212. That hand had written proofs with quiet genius. That hand had been pushed down by authority and lifted up by truth. But now it trembled. The next day, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't a letter.
It was a photo.
A printed shot of their home, taken from a distance. Their mailbox in frame. No note this time, just a message scrawled across the bottom. "Keep pushing, and we'll push back harder." Simone froze, the air catching in her throat. She locked the doors, closed the blinds, and called the police again. This time, they promised an active review, but nothing came of it. She knew now this wasn't just about racism in a classroom. This was about silence as control, about fear as strategy, and they were living in the middle of it. But fear only works when you stop moving, and Simone Townsend had no intention of stopping. That night, she opens her inbox to find an encrypted message from an anonymous sender, with video footage recorded inside the school, showing Mr. Dalton shredding student files labeled "Gifted Referral." The video landed in Simone's inbox just after midnight. No subject line, no signature, just a download link wrapped in encryption. She hovered over it for several minutes, her finger trembling above the mouse. The house was silent, save for the occasional shifting of floorboards and the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. She clicked. A grainy, black and white security feed flickered onto the screen. The timestamp matched a Thursday evening. The room was unmistakable, an office within the school's administrative wing. The angle was high, possibly a ceiling camera. In the frame stood a man with a familiar posture. Mr. Dalton. He stood beside a file cabinet, glancing toward the door, before retrieving a stack of folders. Slowly, methodically, he flipped through them, each one labeled in marker. Gifted Program Referral, 2022. Placement Consideration, 2023. Student Assessment Reports, confidential. His face was partially obscured, but his movements were clear. He shredded them, one by one. No hesitation, no panic, just the cold efficiency of someone erasing what could not be disproven, only destroyed. Simone's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the act. It was the ease, the routine nature of it. Like it had been done before, like it was expected. She replayed the footage twice. Then again, there was no sound, but she could hear the weight of it in her chest. She forwarded the video to Jeanette, then to the attorney who had quietly begun helping them pro bono. By morning, the footage had been passed along to the news station, preparing a follow-up piece. But the real storm hadn't begun. Not yet. The district denied everything, claimed the video was inauthentic, and heavily edited. Mr. Dalton refused interviews. He was seen entering the school through side doors, avoiding the parking lot entirely. But he still stood in front of the class each day, teaching, assigning, pretending Aliyah didn't exist. She walked into room 212 every morning like it didn't matter, even though it did. Her steps were steady, her eyes straight ahead. The whispers didn't stop, but they dulled, like background noise she had learned to mute. Her silence was no longer submission. It was power. She took notes, she solved problems. She didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply she still ached. At night she barely slept. Every creak in the hallway made her bolt upright. Every knock on the door made her heart race. Simone installed new locks. The district placed a single squad car outside their street, twice a week, claiming it was routine community reassurance. It wasn't. It was a statement. And Aliyah read every word between the lines. Her mail came pre-opened. Packages were left in puddles instead of on the porch. Strangers drove slowly past the house and stared too long. She kept her curtains closed now, kept her backpack zipped to her chest during class changes, kept her head down in places she used to feel safe. And yet, she still returned, because leaving meant they won. She wasn't alone. Miss Carter returned to campus the following week. Not as a full-time teacher, but as a rotating academic observer. Her presence shifted the energy in the building. Students noticed. So did staff. She began collecting quiet testimonies. Students who had been overlooked, parents whose concerns had been ignored, counselors who admitted they were told to prioritize specific types of learners. Then she started a petition. It was quiet at first. A Google form. Discreet. Shared among students and parents willing to speak anonymously. The petition called for the reassignment of Mr. Dalton and a formal third-party review of the district's gifted program practices. Within 72 hours, it had over 500 signatures. The administration pushed back, claimed it violated privacy, that it was based on non-verified narratives. But it was too late. Screenshots had circulated. Students were talking, parents were calling, teachers were being asked questions they weren't ready to answer. By the following Monday, a group of students staged a sit-in just outside the cafeteria. They wore tape over their mouths and carried signs that read, "Gifted, not dangerous. Let Black brilliance speak. We deserve more than silence." Aliyah didn't organize it. She didn't attend, but she saw it. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. The school responded with controlled panic. A campus-wide message was sent, urging civility and dialogue. The principal visited classrooms under the guise of checking in. The student resource officer was stationed closer to the main hall. Tension hummed beneath every lesson plan. But something else was happening. Former students now in college, now in jobs, now with distance, began speaking up. Stories appeared in comment sections, in anonymous forums, in local Facebook groups. Students recalled how Mr. Dalton had discouraged them from taking honors-level math, how he made them redo assignments without explanation, how their questions were labeled as disrespectful. The pattern stretched back over a decade. One of them stepped forward publicly. Terrell Manning, 21 years old, former student at the same middle school, now working full-time while attending night classes. He posted a video on social media, just a phone camera, no script, no edits, just He talked about how in 7th grade he had shown promise in math, how he was told not to overextend himself, how his mother was never informed about gifted placement options, how Mr. Dalton had once told him he wasn't the type to test well under pressure. He had believed, dropped out of advanced track, spent years thinking he wasn't enough, until he saw Aliyah's face on TV and recognized the look. It wasn't rage, it was betrayal. Terrell's video hit 100,000 views in 2 days. And then, something broke wide open. A journalist from the national network reached out for an interview. Tyrell agreed. So did 2 other students. Former teachers began contacting Simone and Jeanette, quietly, cautiously. Some still feared retaliation. Others were tired of being afraid. But not everyone welcomed the shift. Simone received another letter, hand-delivered. No postage, no signature. Inside was a single sentence typed in red. "We know where your daughter walks after last period." She gave the note to the police. They took it seriously for once. Increased patrols, additional school surveillance, anonymous tip line extended to parents. But Aya still felt the heat of every stare, the sharpness of every hallway hush. Every step she took felt like a protest now. Every breath an act of defiance. She wasn't just a student anymore. She had become the story. And it was far from over. That same evening, Aliyah's mother receives a late-night phone call from an unknown number. A trembling voice says, "I used to work with Dalton, and I need to tell you what he did to a girl, just like your daughter, before it's too late." The call came just before midnight. Simone nearly ignored it. An unknown number again, but something in her chest wouldn't let her. She answered with a guarded tone, ready to hang up if it was another threat. But the voice on the other end wasn't angry. It wasn't confident. It was trembling. The woman didn't give her full name. Just her first, Melanie. She said she used to work at the same school as Mr. Dalton. Not as a teacher, but as a temporary administrator, filling in while the regular office secretary went on medical leave. That was years ago. But she hadn't forgotten. What she remembered was a girl named Jania, bright, soft-spoken, black. A girl who used to come to the office crying after math class. A girl who was once on track for the gifted program, until she mysteriously never made the list. A girl who, by 8th grade, stopped showing up to school. Simone listened in stunned silence as Melanie continued, her voice cracking in places. She had found one of the incident logs during her rotation. Notes scribbled in the margin of a disciplinary report that had nothing to do with behavior. It had been labeled withdrawn participation and resistance to instruction. She hadn't thought much of it then, but she remembered the look on the girl's face when Dalton passed her in the hallway. Like her presence didn't exist. Like her questions weren't real. She didn't keep copies of the file, but she remembered everything. And now, after watching Elia's story, after seeing the same patterns unfold again, she couldn't stay silent any longer. Simone thanked her, her hands trembling as she ended the call. She added Genia's name to a growing list. Students who had been broken quietly, without bruises, in rooms that looked like learning but felt like something else entirely. The next morning, the silence was broken further. Loudly, Terrell Manning's video exploded. What had begun as a raw, unedited confession on social media had been shared across every major platform. Tyrell spoke straight into the camera, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. He didn't just talk about his experience, he exposed it. How Dalton mocked him for asking a question about a geometry proof. How that humiliation echoed louder than any lesson. How he began skipping class. How his teachers stopped calling home. How no one asked why he disappeared. He said the words that rang across timelines like a siren. He didn't just ignore us, he erased us. Within hours, others followed. A former student in Florida, who had transferred in for one semester and left after a single marking period, under Dalton's instruction. A mother in the district who never received test score results for her son, only a letter saying he hadn't met expectations. A former para-educator who left teaching after her concerns were dismissed repeatedly. Their stories weren't just similar, they were identical in shape, language, and outcome. Each child was Black or Latino. Each showed early signs of academic strength. Each was silenced or redirected. The pressure reached a boiling point. Local news ran feature segments. A state senator called for district transparency. Civil rights organizations issued statements. School board members who had once defended Dalton now scheduled emergency meetings. The district, cornered and desperate, announced the one thing it had resisted all along: an independent investigation. Not internal, not partial, not quiet. A full-scale review of all gifted program referrals, student placements and teacher evaluations from the last 50. And for the first time, the investigation would include testimony from former students. Elia was watching the announcement live when the news anchor paused mid-segment. They had breaking coverage. An education equity summit scheduled months ago had just extended a special invitation. To her, not to Simone, not to the school, to Elia Townsend. She was invited to speak on the national stage. Simone stared at the screen, her lips slightly parted. Elia didn't say anything. She didn't blink, but her eyes shimmered with something unfamiliar. Recognition. Not of attention, but of responsibility. She wasn't being asked to relive what happened. She was being asked to lead. That night, they sat at the kitchen table, the invitation letter printed and folded between them. It was formal, impeccable, flattering. But more than that, it was dangerous. Speaking at the summit meant walking into a room full of policymakers, school leaders, reporters, critics and skeptics. It meant naming names. It meant being seen again. Elia didn't make her decision right away. She spent hours alone in her room, staring at the ceiling, remembering the desks, the laughter, the hallway echoes, the taste of silence. But then she thought about Tyrell, about Janine, about the faces she never met but somehow already knew. When she returned to the kitchen, she didn't say yes. She just unfolded the letter, placed it into her backpack, and zipped it shut. The message was clear. She would speak, but the aftermath wouldn't wait. While the district scrambled to save face, while media trucks parked outside their home, while the summit announcement circled national news feeds, Mr. Dalton stayed silent, until he didn't. Late that evening, a video appeared online, grainy, shaky, taken by someone walking through a parking lot. It showed Dalton speaking on the phone. His words were partially muffled, but one sentence rang clearly through the wind.
I've been protecting that program for years. If it collapses, I'm not going down alone.
The next morning, an anonymous package arrives at the Townsend home. Inside are internal memos hinting at other educators involved in suppressing referrals, and a list with Elia's name at the top, marked with red ink and the word watch. The plane touched down in Washington, D.C. just after sunrise. The sky was still wrapped in that soft early morning blue, the kind that made everything feel quiet, suspended. From the window seat, Elia watched the city stretch out beneath her, its monuments bathed in light,
that seemed almost theatrical. She held her backpack tightly against her chest, her fingers tapping lightly against the zipper. She wasn't nervous, not anymore, but something deeper stirred inside her, a pressure, a weight, not from fear but from purpose.
She was 14 years old, and she was about to speak before a room of national educators, superintendents, equity directors, journalists, and government officials. The Education Equity Summit was being held inside one of the largest halls in the Capitol Conference Center. Rows of chairs lined the floor. Cameras stood at every corner. Her name appeared on the digital agenda, displayed between seasoned experts and high-profile figures. But it was her name that the press kept circling. Her name that drew eyes. Her name that caused silence when read aloud in rooms that once refused to say it at all. Alia Townsend. Student testimony. The invisible cost of suppressed potential. She stepped onto the stage wearing navy blue slacks and a cream blouse, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. No jewelry. No makeup. Just her truth. The lights were hot. The podium felt too tall. But when she adjusted the mic and began speaking, her voice didn't shake. She started with a number. 7. 7 times she had raised her hand in one math class before being acknowledged. 7 times, in 1 week, she had been passed over, ignored, sidelined. She described the silence that followed each dismissal, not just from her teacher, but from classmates, counselors, and policies. She spoke about gifted testing referrals that never came, about watching students less prepared being pushed forward while she was told to slow down. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for sympathy. She used her voice like a blade, cutting through politeness, through bureaucratic camouflage, through decades of practices that positioned intelligence as something that needed to look a certain way before it was respected. She didn't name Mr. Dalton directly. She named the school. She named the district. She named the data. She read excerpts from district-wide equity audits that had never been published. She exposed policies that funneled Black students out of accelerated programs by using behavioral markers as gatekeepers. She quoted from her math journal, the same one that had been ripped apart in anger. Now its fragments were quoted in front of national leaders. When she finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It exhaled, a long collective breath, as if the audience hadn't realized they'd been holding it. The applause came after, a sound like breaking glass, shattering decorum, piercing silence. After the speech, people approached her like she was a head of state. Senators asked for meetings. Ivy League institutions sent early outreach. Mentorship programs reached out. Scholarships flooded her inbox. Invitations to speak, to write, to lead. Simone watched it unfold from the edge of the stage, her hands clasped tightly as her daughter stood not just tall but untouchable. But Alia was careful. She accepted the support. She rejected the erasure. She made it clear in every interview, she was not here for a redemption arc. This wasn't a feel-good story. This wasn't a turnaround. This was a reckoning. She wasn't saved by education. She had survived it. Her success didn't prove the system worked. It proved that she had endured what the system tried to crush. And when she returned home, she didn't celebrate. She returned to work. She released her speech online, unfiltered, unedited, with footnotes and citations. She created a public archive of suppressed gifted referrals, testimony transcripts, and data breakdowns. She called it the ledger. It wasn't just a resource. It was a record of what had been denied. And still, amid all of this, Mr. Dalton remained silent. No rebuttal. No press statement.
No lawsuit.
Just silence. Until one afternoon, without warning, the school district's website published a notice, a public letter, written by Mr. Dalton. The statement was brief, just 4 paragraphs, but it sent shockwaves through the community. He did not deny the events. He did not challenge the data. He did not defend the shredded files, the disproven test accusations, or the suppressed referrals. Instead, he claimed something far more disturbing. That he had been operating under institutional guidance. That the district had set expectations for gifted placements that were never explicitly about race, but were always racially understood. He admitted that there was an unspoken rule about who was encouraged to apply, who was quietly redirected, and who was never meant to advance. He positioned himself not as the architect of discrimination, but as its obedient instrument. He named no one, but he implicated everyone. And at the end of the letter, one sentence stood alone. They'll paint me as the villain, but I was only ever following what they refused to write down. The internet exploded. Some called it a deflection. Others called it a confession. Teachers who had remained silent began texting one another. Parents demanded clarity. Reporters requested interviews. The district pulled the statement down within hours, claiming it hadn't been approved for release, but screenshots were forever. Within 24 hours, national news outlets were running headlines. The Department of Education issued a statement. A state attorney general launched an inquiry. A federal education watchdog requested records from multiple districts statewide. And Alea? She didn't flinch. She issued her own statement online. 4 sentences. He didn't break the system. He followed it. And that's the real scandal. My name isn't the only one buried in red ink. The next morning, she receives a thick, unmarked envelope at her doorstep. Inside is a copy of a 20-year-old internal memo from the district, listing names of other teachers who were removed quietly for over-identifying black students for gifted placement. The denial came not in a press release, not in a school newsletter, not even in a written op-ed, but on live television. Mr. Dalton sat beneath the sterile glow of studio lights, framed by a soft blue backdrop with the station's logo repeating like wallpaper behind him. His suit was pressed, his hair carefully parted, his posture rehearsed. His expression was one of practiced restraint, strange just enough to appear burdened, but not enough to reveal guilt. He looked into the camera with eyes that had spent years glancing past raised hands like Alia's. And then he spoke. Not with contrition, but with calculation. He called the accusations coordinated, exaggerated, and rooted in personal vendettas. He framed himself as a dedicated educator who had spent decades serving all students, and was now the victim of a national hysteria designed to villainize teachers trying to maintain academic standards. He mentioned Alaya's name once. He didn't question her intelligence. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he questioned the timing of her rise, the political optics, the media frenzy. He painted a picture of himself as a casualty of cultural overcorrection, the sacrificial lamb in a moment where accountability was confused with revenge. And then he said the line that exploded across the country in less than an hour. I never suppressed brilliance. I simply enforced the rules. If those rules are flawed, punish the system, not me. The camera lingered for half a second too long after his words landed. The silence that followed wasn't sympathy. It was disbelief. He hadn't denied the evidence. He hadn't addressed the memos. He hadn't disputed the testimonies. He had simply reframed himself as the misunderstood victim. Within minutes, hashtags trended again, but this time the tone was sharper, angrier, more disillusioned. Even those who had initially questioned Alaya's story couldn't ignore the wave of facts that had already emerged. The shredded documents, the hidden referrals, the suppressed placement forms, the 20-year-old memo naming teachers who had been quietly removed for advocating for black students. Major outlets replayed Dalton's interview with side-by-side graphics of the mounting evidence. Screenshots of his emails ran across the screen as his denials played in slow motion. The public backlash was immediate, and the school board, under pressure from activists, attorneys, and the Department of Education, called an emergency public hearing. It was held in the same auditorium where students once received attendance awards, and holiday music concerts filled the seats with parents sipping coffee. But this time, the seats were filled with protest signs, legal representatives, and journalists adjusting their camera angles. A podium was placed center stage, microphones, time limits, a 3-minute window for public comments, and a table at the front where Mr. Dalton sat stone-faced, flanked by lawyers. Simone attended. So did Jeanette. Eli came too, though his parents remained at the back, visibly tense. Julia did not speak. She had already spoken to the nation. She didn't owe the room her voice again. But she sat in the front row, her gaze locked forward. The hearing lasted over 2 hours. Educators spoke. Parents testified. Former students submitted letters. The board members listened, or at least pretended to. Their discomfort was visible in every shift of posture, every scribbled note, every calculated silence. Then the superintendent stood and announced that Mr. Dalton would be placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. It was not a termination, not yet, but it was the first crack in the armor that had once protected him with silence. The announcement sparked cheers from half the room. The other half sat still, angry not because Dalton was punished, but because they still saw his actions as just holding the line. Alaya didn't cheer. She stood and walked out. That night, the district sent a school-wide email. It was filled with carefully chosen language about community healing, rebuilding trust, and creating space for meaningful dialogue. It was the kind of email that said a lot but meant very little. But buried halfway down, a single paragraph stood out. It announced a new initiative, student-led classrooms, designed to honor diverse learning perspectives. One school, as part of the pilot, would be offering students the opportunity to design and lead a single lesson plan in an academic subject of their choice. It was meant as outreach, as optics, as damage control. But when Elia read the email, something inside her stirred, not with hesitation but with intent. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need a hashtag. She wanted the chalk. The very next morning, she marched into the office of the acting principal, Mr. Hatcher, a younger administrator temporarily filling in, and requested to participate. She didn't wait for permission. She submitted a lesson plan, thorough, layered, and aligned with national standards. Title: Proof of Potential, Redefining How We Measure Brilliance. The application sat on Mr. Hatcher's desk for less than 24 hours before he approved it. Word spread quickly. Elia Townsend, once accused of cheating, once erased from gifted lists, once shamed for her questions, was going to teach. Some students whispered she was taking over the class. Others mocked her behind screens. A few parents complained. But the date was set. Friday morning. Room 212. The very room where she had been silenced. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The day before her guest teaching slot, Elia stayed late after school. She sat alone at the front of the classroom, arranging materials, preparing slides, rewriting notes, not because she was nervous, but because she understood the weight of what was coming. She wasn't just walking back into the space that had once denied her. She was about to take control of it, but just as she packed up her binder and rose to leave, a knock echoed from the doorway. A staff member she didn't recognize stepped inside holding a brown envelope. No words, just a quick nod. Elia took the envelope and waited until the hallway was clear before opening it. Inside was a printout, a class roster, her name circled in red, and beneath it, scrawled in ink, "Let's see if you can lead when the eyes aren't watching." The next morning, Elia arrives to teach, but finds her lesson plan erased from the board, her materials trashed, and a single sentence scrawled across the whiteboard in permanent marker. "You're still just a student." The morning air felt heavier than usual as Elia walked through the school's front doors, her sneakers pressed against the tiled hallway, each step echoing louder in her head than in reality. Teachers passed her, nodding cautiously, some with pride, others with forced neutrality. Students shifted against lockers, stealing glances, whispering things they weren't brave enough to say aloud. Room 212 loomed ahead. She stopped for a moment at the threshold. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. The room was unlocked, lights already on, but what greeted her inside wasn't preparation. It was erasure. Her name had been wiped from the whiteboard. Her printed lesson plan, once neatly stacked on each desk, was torn and crumpled in the wastebasket. The word teacher had been scratched off the class agenda and replaced with red permanent marker. Still just a student. The ink bled through the surface, thick and unrepentant. For a split second, her body stiffened. Not in fear, but in recognition. She had seen this before, not in exact form, but in tone. That need to remind her of her place, that compulsion to claw back power, when someone unexpected dares to rise. Elia walked calmly to the front of the room. She set her backpack on the desk and removed a fresh dry erase marker. She didn't touch the words left behind. She didn't try to clean them off. She simply walked to the far corner of the board, her own space, and began writing. Lesson objective: Introduction to Mathematical Proof and Real-World Logic Models. The bell rang. Students filed in slowly, awkwardly. A few looked down at their phones. A few took photos of the vandalized board. One girl whispered, "They really did that." Another shrugged, whispering back, "She's still here though." They filled the seats, the same desks that once seemed to distance her from everything. Now those chairs were turned toward her. No longer classmates, but an audience waiting to see if she would shrink. She didn't. She faced them and began to speak. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. She opened with a simple question. Have you ever been told you were wrong when you were actually right? The room stilled. Some eyes darted away, others locked onto her, brows furrowing, not because they didn't understand, but because they understood too well. She walked them through the basics of mathematical proof. How logic works, how every equation, every statement, must be built from something provable, something no one can deny. And then she showed them how those same rules applied beyond numbers, to decisions, to gatekeeping, to systems. She referenced a problem from the state's standardized test, one that had caused confusion among teachers for its complexity. She solved it step by step, not with arrogance, but with clarity. Each movement of her hand across the board was deliberate. Each explanation peeled back layers of understanding the class didn't know they needed. Whispers died. Pens clicked. Notebooks opened. Even the students who had once laughed at her, who had once joined in the whisper campaign, found themselves scribbling down her words. Some looked stunned, others embarrassed. A boy in the back, who had once mimicked her for talking like a calculator, now leaned forward, following each line she drew. She paused halfway through to ask if there were questions. No one spoke, not because they didn't have them, but because they didn't want to interrupt. She moved into the real-world logic model, explaining how math isn't just numbers but the foundation of truth. How, just like in logic, you can trace lies back to their origin, and how erasure leaves a footprint when you know how to see it. With each line, each word, Aliyah reclaimed the space, not with defiance, but with brilliance. Then, without skipping a beat, she moved to her closing. She erased the corner where she had written the lesson objective, and wrote one final line beneath it. Sometimes genius whispers, because shouting never worked. She turned to face them. Your brilliance isn't loud. It's not always obvious, but it's there, and no one gets to erase that just because they don't understand it. There was no applause at first, just silence, the kind that holds weight. Then a single clap, followed by another. Then the sound multiplied, awkward, genuine, rising, a slow, building wave of appreciation. Not out of politeness, not out of obligation, but awe, not for the lesson, but for what it meant. She didn't smile, not fully. She just nodded once, collected her things, and walked toward the door. But just before she reached it, just before her hand touched the frame, she noticed a shadow in the hallway, standing still, watching through the narrow window in the door. Mr. Dalton, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, not shocked, not furious, but something else. A recognition, not that she had proven him wrong, but that she no longer needed his validation. That evening, the footage of her lesson is leaked online, recorded secretly by a student. It goes viral, but buried in the comments is a chilling post. She thinks she's free. She doesn't know what's coming next. The morning light in the Townsend home was soft, filtered through curtains, drawn to block the relentless glare of external attention. Yet inside the house, the air felt different, less survival, more possibility. People had started calling, not just reporters, but educators, nonprofit leaders, state legislators, even textbook authors. The momentum that once pressed so heavily on Aliyah and her mother now carried a new freight change. Aliyah no longer walked quietly through the halls. She walked with a journal in hand, her journal that had once been a repository of questions, of shame, of silence. Now it was filled with her own theories, sketches of mathematical models, notes of inquiry about equity, pages titled Logic of Inclusion. She had come to believe that math and justice shared a language of proof, that one could dismantle structures just as one could prove a theorem. The district where she had once sat, invisible, began hosting hearings on equity in gifted programs. The proposal of a law formally named the Townsend Equity in Gifted Education Act surfaced in state capitals. It demanded transparency in referral data, mandated audits of gifted placements, and disallowed tracking by behavioral marker alone. The law carried her name, not because she wanted fame, but because she represented the truth of what had been denied. Schools across the country added her story to lesson plans, not as a prize for overcoming, but as a mirror for systems. Teachers framed her speech in Washington as a case study. When the silenced student becomes the speaker, classroom discussions turned from "can she, why wasn't she?" Students drew parallels between their own invisible barriers and hers. Aliyah returned to room 212. Not as a student, but as a visitor. She sat in the front row in one of the seats she once avoided, notebook open and pen ready. She watched students struggle with logic, raise tentative hands, answer with care. She smiled quietly as she listened to their voices rise where she had once stifled them. It felt right. It felt full. Her mother, Simone, stood at the edge of the room silently, proud but quiet. She didn't speak of the media, the law, the podcasts. She spoke of this moment, The simple one. A girl asking a question, and a class listening. Unexpectedly one afternoon, an envelope slid through their mailbox. No return address. Just a typed name. Elia Townsend. Inside was a letter from a national foundation, offering a grant. Not just any grant. A grant to fund summer math camps for underrepresented youth, with Elia as the lead designer. The letter referenced her journal, her speech, her testimony. She held the letter in her hands, and thought of the nights she had torn pages, the walls that had said too much, the teacher who had said no, and now she held proof that those pages mattered. The foundation expected a pilot program by September. She looked across to her mother. Their eyes locked. In that moment, a silent agreement passed between them. This wasn't just about recognition, it was about responsibility. But as the foundation calls came in and the curriculum drafts took shape, the darker currents beneath the surface began to stir. One evening, Aaliyah found an article buried deep in education policy archives. It was about a district in another state that had quietly settled lawsuits, alleging denial of gifted placements for minority students. The similarities were unsettling. The same language of student readiness, the same hidden spreadsheets, the same roster gaps, the same man's name appeared, Mr. Dalton. Her stomach turned. She realized her fight was local. Her legacy could become national. But to do that, she needed to shift from story to system. She needed to dismantle the blueprint. She called Jeanette Robbins and Simone into her room. She laid out the evidence, maps of referral disparities, graphs of gifted enrollment by race, testimonies she had collected. Her journal lay open among these artifacts. It wasn't just hers anymore. It was theirs. The hours of students silenced, futures deferred. The voices of change came from all sides now. Officials requested meetings with her. Universities offered adjunct research appointments. She accepted one, with one condition: no talk of overcoming. Only talk of uncovering. And yet, through the progress, there was the undercurrent of resistance. White parents and educators who felt the policy threatened them. A podcast dismissed her as a trend story. An editorial warned that focusing on race in gifted programs would lower standards. The fight didn't vanish. It changed shape. On the day of her first summer camp launch, hundreds of children arrived, young and eager. They sat in groups, coloring worksheets titled Proof of Potential. Aaliyah walked through the room, handing out notebooks branded with the Townsend Journal logo she had redesigned. She knelt to speak to a shy girl who reminded her of the version of herself that had stopped raising her hand. The girl's eyes lit up and whispered, "My answer," before trailing off. Aaliyah smiled and waited, because she knew the answer wasn't in her book. It was inside the question. The media arrived. Not for her this time, but for the campers. Cameras captured chalkboards filled with student solutions, notebooks thicker than most first-week workbooks, and children discussing proofs as if they were stories. Parents approached Aaliyah with gratitude. Teachers asked for curricula. Administrators asked for data. They all wanted the story. But she reminded them, this isn't about one girl. It's about one system. And then the unexpected twist. She received a call from the Massachusetts Educational Board. They had obtained the internal memo Aaliyah found, the one listing teachers quietly removed for advocating for Black students. Among its pages was a plan to distribute a gifted excellence indicator to staff in all schools, a tool to track gifted referrals. The twist: the memos showed that Mr. Dalton had been an instructor on the rollout of that very tool, meaning he wasn't just a participant in a flawed system. He was a trainer. The implications were national. She exhaled slowly. The weight of it didn't scare her. It challenged her, energized her. And as the summit she had spoken at months ago shifted into the camp she now hosted, and the law named for her moved through committee, she realized her story had morphed. She wasn't just teaching others, she was rewriting the script. Her name would be etched in committee hearings, textbooks, and references. But she didn't want that to be the end. She wanted the beginning. Climate change of sorts within education. And as she stood in the front of the class, watching children argue over proofs with the ferocity of future leaders, she felt something settle in her chest. Less anger, more power. She had been invisible. Now she was instrumental. And America was watching. That evening, she opens the mailbox to find a formal collaboration offer from Harvard University, inviting her to co-design a national curriculum for underrepresented youth in STEM, with one condition: full disclosure of all internal gifted program data from affiliated districts. No child should be punished for being brilliant, especially not because of the color of their skin. If Alaya's story made you feel something, if it reminded you how deep injustice can run in plain sight, type yes. If you believe every voice deserves to be heard.